Welcome back to part 3. So turning now to a little bit of theory, one area that is useful when we're looking at multimodality and actually making sense of it is semiotics, and here semiosis. So semiosis is the process that we go through of making sense of what we see in signs and symbols. So semiotics is the study of signs and symbols. And for those of you who are taking Language in the Media 2 after Christmas, we will be covering semiotics in quite considerable depth. So what's useful to know here is that there are a couple of theorists who are essentially the fathers of semiotics. One is Ferdinand de Saussure, who you may well have heard of because he's a very famous linguist from the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And the other one is Peirce. And Peirce was a philosopher, but he looked at semiotics as well. And the reason why Peirce is being referenced here is because Peirce believed that the object itself, the thing that is actually being referenced by the symbol, is important, as well as us, because we're the person interpreting it. We need to, and we do, we use the real thing in the world when we're interpreting images and when we're interpreting any symbol, including words. We actually have a concept that includes the sound of the word. We know what that means. We know what the word means when we see it written down. And also, if it's a physical object that exists in the world, we will also have that as part of our concept. So, this semiosis actually, it takes place constantly. So we make these links, we connect things, and that's what's happening when we're looking at different modes. And when we're looking at media that use different modes. So when we're looking at something like this, these early cave paintings, we make the connection between the image and the real object in the world. So, and these paintings, even though they are thousands and thousands of years old, they are still very recognisable to us in the modern day as animals. We can see that on the right hand side there is some sort of cattle, either a bull or a cow, because both bulls and cows can have horns. But we can see that that's some sort of large, as I say, some sort of cattle. And then in the centre there, it looks to be rather like a horse. And then below that, what looks like sheep. So, the animals that we would regard now as domestic farm animals, but all depicted here. We have no idea why they were depicted, but they have been recorded. And that means that we can, of course, now look at them, but we actually don't know what message is being communicated here, other than these things existed. So we have always had then further new types of media arriving, and unless we have some sort of context that we can set the new communication forms into, we won't necessarily be able to understand it. So as we don't have any further part of this image is just images, we don't have words with it, so we can't absolutely locate it, contextualize it, and really understand what is being communicated here. But that notion of new media has always been problematic. So if we look at what Plato said, so this, as you can see, is from 370 BC, and Plato here is complaining that children in particular, but people in general, are learning to write, and if they write, they will forget how to learn things, they won't use their memories, and they will trust the external written characters, the writing, and they won't remember themselves. So this is very much the same argument that is made now about people playing video games or spending a great deal of time on their phones, that, well, if they keep on doing that, they won't get outside, or, if they play video games, they'll be violent, and so on. And also, certainly I know when I was a kid at school, I was told, and my class was told repeatedly by maths teachers, that we needed to make sure that we were really good at knowing our times tables and mental arithmetic, because we would not be able to carry a calculator around in our pockets with us. Well, I don't know about you, but I carry my mobile phone with me in my pocket, and that has a calculator on it. So, ha! My maths teacher was wrong. But the point being, we've always had people who have disliked new media, new forms of media, digitalisation, being the one that we're faced with at the moment. And we've always had a fear. People always have a fear of change, and that's essentially what Plato is. That's his writing here describes his fear of change. So, and some change is good and some isn't so good. So, are we actually moving onwards into new forms of literacy? Are we going to have a digital renaissance? And maybe we should be thinking of all of these different forms of communication. What do you think? Should we, when we're studying language, should we be looking at images and moving images, as this module does? Should we be taking all of those into account? Should we just be looking at words and text? Or should we just be looking at spoken communication? So, multimodality, of course, is just that, multiple. So during this module so far, and we haven't reached the end just yet, we've still got another couple of weeks, but so far we've looked at spoken forms. We've looked at things like stand-up comedy, as we did last week. We have looked at written forms, and we can analyse exactly what has been written down using lots of different frameworks. When we looked at news discourses and how narrative works in media, we looked at some prose fiction. So, we can look at different modes. So we can look at speech, we can look at written text, we can also look at images, and we can look at still images, as this particular essay question begins to ask you to interrogate and to actually begin to engage with. So we can look at how pictures, photographs have been composed, how they've been edited, and what readings they might suggest to us. But we can also look at moving images, and those of you that did the genre essay question, so in the first half of this term, we looked at some moving images with the notion of genre, and how film trailers can be an extremely good way of helping us to locate a film's particular genre, just in a short sort of 3-minute clip, the trailer. So we've looked at these different modes. Should we be doing that? Should we be looking at how we communicate in multiple different modes, or should we only be looking at one? What do you think? Personally, I think we should be looking at different modes, simply because they are all forms of communication, and if we really want to understand how we communicate with one another today, now, in the digital era, we need to begin to understand each of these modes. So this, as you can see, is from the New London Group, and it's a pedagogy of multiliteracies. And pedagogy is essentially sort of a theory of teaching, how you learn things. And this is, how you can begin to learn multiple different literacies. So not just spoken languages, so we might go and learn French or German or Russian or Mandarin, excuse me. But actually, even within each language, we have multiple different types of languages, multiple modes. So as you can see there, we've got different modes of meaning, as well as different design elements, and those modes of meaning, as it says there, can be the way that language has been designed, linguistics. So the elements, including things like how things are delivered, the vocabulary, the metaphors, and and how all of that works, how language works. But we can also look at things like visual design, like colours, perspective, and so on. And that is, as I've said, some part of this particular essay question, because if you're going to look at the multimodal layout of something like a newspaper page, then you are going to have to take into account the visual elements and what they mean, where they're situated, which colours have been used, and further what readings these might have. We might also look at, as it says on there as well, audio design, and those of you that did that genre essay may well have drawn into your assignments how particular film genres use certain types of music and sound effects that actually add to the genre. So, creepy music, and sort of sound effects in sort of, as I say, things like creepy movies. And then also we might want to think about spatial design. So it says there, things like ecosystem and geographic meanings, architectural meanings, and so on. And that notion of spatial design and where things are positioned within the world, that's been quite important in the last few days, the last week or so, when we had in America Rudy Giuliani holding a press conference at the Four Seasons, and this huge gaffe of thinking that he was presumably thinking that he was going to go to the Four Seasons Hotel, but instead he went to this landscape sort of garden centre called the Four Seasons. And that in itself was sort of quite humorous, because the press conference took place in the car park of this garden centre. But on top of that were the other shops that were around the garden centre. And, there was an adult shop there that, there's been quite a lot of fun made of, that Rudy Giuliani was outside essentially a shop that sold porn and various other items, shall we say, and also that it was next to an undertaker's or crematorium. So a very, very strange geographical setting, but that also adds to what was meant, even if it was unintentional. But that those meanings are there, and we can sort of we can draw conclusions about what went on and why that particular place was chosen. And it certainly seems as though it was entirely coincidental, to the point of being comedic. And then the last one that we have down there at the bottom there, gestural design. So, body language, and, whether somebody perhaps the way that they tilt their head, maybe the way that they gesture with their hands whilst they talk. And again, what that means if we have a still image of somebody looking up, or somebody pointing at you, all of these mean different things. So if you're going to do this essay, you will need to make sure that you are actually looking at all of these design elements, all of these multimodal elements. Now, some of them may not be of use. So, for instance, if you are looking at a front page of a newspaper, audio design is probably not going to be of any use. It could be that you're looking at an online version, and maybe there is, sort of moving images, and you can play that, and there may be music with it. What does that mean? How does that tell you more of the story? How is more meaning actually conveyed? So this is an extremely useful diagram, just to remind you, if you're doing this assignment, of the sorts of things that you need to take into account when you're thinking about multimodality, and how we actually have a message communicated in more than one single mode. It's not just in text, it's in all of these things. So new media, this idea of digitalisation, they definitely affect our idea of the text, because we are no longer taking for granted that the text is just meaning words printed on a page. It is more than that. So, we have these multiple different ways that we can actually engage with meaning and communication. And, those ways are on the previous slide, all of those different types of modes. And that's all been brought about by the arrival of digitalisation and the internet. So also think about, as it says there, in what ways is your reading of multimodal texts different from conventional print media? So when you're looking at a newspaper page online on a news website, because we can compare that very simply to a newspaper page, so we can look at the conventional print media and we can look at the digital, online, multimodal, or very multimodal, because of course the print media is also multimodal because it has images, but we have multiple different modes appearing on an online page. So how do you read those differently? So do think about that. What do you do when you pick up a newspaper? Do you, as some people do you turn to the back first? Because when you're looking at a print newspaper, some people will turn to the back first because they want to look at the sports news. Other people will glance at the first page and maybe then quickly turn to, maybe there's a big news story on the front and it says, more news in, this story's continued on page 6. Maybe they follow a particular story through, or maybe they know that there's something in the middle of the newspaper that they want to see. So maybe they already have an idea of particular things they want to look at. Or do you glance at the first page and essentially just flip through the pages until you find a story that is of interest? Or do you actually read every single thing on the front page, then turn over, read every single thing on page 2, and then, and constantly sort of starting in the top left-hand corner and working your way down to the bottom right? Do you do that on every page? So that's the other thing to think about, is that it's not just how you approach the entire newspaper, and likewise, how do you approach the news websites? When you're looking at them, if you go to the BBC News website, for example, do you go and look at your local area of news first, or do you look at the world news first, or the breaking news, and so on? So think about how you actually navigate that. Is it the same as when you navigate a print newspaper? And is it then, when you've sort of looked at how you navigate the whole thing, then also think about how you look at a particular page? Do you start in the top left and finish on the bottom right? Or does your eye dot over the page and go backwards and forwards? And is your eye drawn to the images first, the headline first? What is it that you glance at without even realising? So think about the ways that we actually read in different forms, and these different reading strategies that we have, and also then start to think about that second question there. So what effects might these different reading strategies have on the process of writing those texts? So this is for journalistic practice. So this will be particularly of use for those of you thinking of taking my Writing in the Media module next year, in the 3rd year, where of course we will be writing newspaper articles. So start to think about, well, what does it mean if people are only reading the headline? What does that mean if you're a journalist? What does your headline have to do? And, of course, it means things like you have to make sure that your headline grabs people. And this, of course, is where we've had the rise of things like clickbait. So think of all of those different aspects. Also start to think about semiotics and, this analysis of actually looking at the signs and the symbols. What is implied? What are the connotations of what we see? And does that actually help us to be able to read in further additional meanings because there are certain signs and symbols there? And what about narrative theory that we've already looked at? How does that help us? Would that be of use? Does it help us when we actually read a newspaper and read a magazine? But, particularly when we're looking at the news, does it help that we know that news stories are just that, created stories, and they fit to a particular existing story, those sort of archetypal stories? Does that help to know that? So there's some questions to think about. You might also want to have a look at this particular website. So it looks very clunky. It is quite an old site now, but it's a very useful one. So it's called Oldton, and it is a digital writing website. It started out because the chap that set it up, and the details are all on the next slide, which I'll get to in a moment, he got a grant. He's an academic. He got a grant to actually set up this website, and the idea was that based upon his own experiences of leaving a particular town when he was a child after his father had died, he and his mother moved away, and of course the town changed. He returned to the old town, so that's where Oldton comes from, and he took photos, and he was trying to, as it says there, make sense of his past. So you can see at the bottom there it says, please help me make sense of my past, and it's Tim Wright, and this is from April 2004, so 16 years ago now. So he posted photographs and snippets of stories that he could remember about his childhood and about this town. And he also put up the photographs as well. And then what happened was that people started to add to the stories and add to the map, and created this town that does not exist but is based on not even a shared collective memory, but it's a shared space where people can put in their memories and sometimes just completely fabricated ideas about things from their childhood and different parts of this fictitious town. So it's a virtual place that has never ever existed, but it's been made creative, or created as a community. The people who did this, they put it all together collaboratively. So here, that's the link to the site, and it's a very interesting idea. So we've got images that are real images, but then we've got stories that aren't real at all. So it's a fictional world. So do have a look at that. It's quite interesting. And there are more of this type of thing goes on, where people sort of create these entire fictional worlds. And those of you that took tackling text last year will already have a sort of an understanding of what a story world is, and that's essentially what was being created here. But it's a mixture between the real and the fictional. So I'm going to leave you with this quote to think about. Really, universally, relations stop nowhere, and the exquisite problem of the writer is eternally but to draw, by a geometry of his own, the circle within which they shall happily appear to do so.